Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'm a senior research associate from the University of Cambridge, and I do hardware security research for quite some time, testing microcontrollers, smart cards, FPGA, system on chips, and I have broad knowledge of various background from chemistry to computer science. And my research interest is trying to find real solutions to impossible problems, developing new attack technologies, and testing challenging hardware devices. So in the past, I've found lots of problems, or sometimes even created problems for industry. The first one was the optical fault injection attacks that still many manufacturers are trying to defeat. And I proved data remnants not only exist in SRAM but also in EEPROM and Flash, demonstrated that combined attacks are more powerful, and then managed to extract the ES key from using bumping attacks, and found backdoor in military FPGA, and proved FBI RON with impossible non-mirroring on iPhone, and I demonstrated that EEPROM and Flash could be read under electron microscope, and my latest presentation on hardwear.io that was virtual was about finding a backdoor through NVM vulnerability in ECC authentication device. So why I present Ironkey today is because when you look at the package of the Ironkey device, it says it's world's most secure flash drive, and it's FIPS certified. That means it can be sold to military and government users. And it would also be a good candidate for our student hardware security practical, because the last device that we used was completely broken, and that I presented last time at hardwear.io. And also that was recently in use when a legitimate user was unable to find, to remember the password and get access to cryptocurrency assets. And there do exist public evaluations of various encrypted USB drives, but not on Ironkey. So it would be good to compare Ironkey with our secure USB drives. And also the results could help in mitigating the data leakages in the future. And also if there are any secure chips inside, they would be evaluated as well. And so it would be a good target to be curious what is inside, because it's not easy to get to the PCB inside those devices. So that's why I do reverse engineering, or someone call it teardown. So encrypted USB flash drives were evaluated. As I mentioned, there are some master thesis and presentation from Google researchers, but none on Ironkey. And so I started testing Ironkey devices from one that was in my desk for quite some time, because those devices are not very user-friendly. You have to fiddle around. They're not working with all operating systems. And then I ordered a few more devices on eBay and ordered some latest models. And then I started looking at the encrypted drives from other manufacturers. And I ended up actually looking at 26 different devices, 9 families of Ironkeys, 15 USB drives from other manufacturers. And also I looked at crypto wallet devices, and I tested USB controllers and secure chips inside. So USB flash drives appeared on the market in the early 2000s, and they were compact devices with decent storage. But if you lose those devices, anyone can access the data. So that was the idea about behind Ironkey Corporation was developing Ironkey, and they released it in 2007. So user data were always encrypted with AES-256 in CBC or XTS mode. And AES key itself was encrypted with the user password and never leaves the device. And they limited the number of incorrect password attempts. And also the user application that was communicating with the device was stored on a separate partition that appeared as CD-ROM drive, so it cannot be modified. And also the communication between the software and the USB drive was encrypted. It has lots of hardware features. It has a robust metal case which was tamper-proof and waterproof. And the inner part of the case was ported with epoxy to prevent easy access to the PCB. And they use specialized USB controller with hardware ES encryption. And for secure storage of AES key, and password verification is used a specialized secure chip and also the reliable flash memory storage. So a few words about the Ironkey history. So it was an internet security and privacy company from late 90s. It developed Ironkey device between 2005-2007, and for that they attracted quite a lot of funds from US government and private investors. They aimed at military, government, and corporate users, and that's why they certified their devices the FIPS to level 3. It has a robust case, and it relied on a secure chip for AES encryption. First device was released in 2007. However, it was only certified to level 2. And the next revision was in 2008 with more robust case and modified hardware. Then the improved version was released next year with 3 new devices, and those devices were finally certified to level 3. However, in 2011, eMMC Corporation bought the Ironkey business, and since that time it was sold under eMMC name. So eMMC Corporation was already a storage device manufacturer, and right before buying the Ironkey, they acquired another company, MXI Security, and that had some secure devices already on the market, and those devices were sold as Defender F100 and F150. So eMMC didn't invent anything new, they just renamed those devices to Ironkey F100 and 150, and they were already certified to level 3. And then later they came up with F200 with biometric identification. And in 2013, they brought 2 new devices with improved characteristics and also certified to level 3. However, a year later, they decided to bring a budgetary version of Ironkey device to the market, and surprisingly, that one had a plastic case and no certification at all. And then in 2015, they finally brought USB 3 device that was quite late for the market, because by that time, for several years, other competitors were already selling USB 3 devices with normal storage. So in that respect, Ironkey was quite slow devices. And this particular device was the fastest USB encrypted device on the market. However, still in 2016, they decided to sell Ironkey business, and that was split between DataLocker and Kingston. So Kingston Digital was the manufacturer and distributor of memory products and part of Kingston Technology. And by the time they acquired Ironkey business, they already had their own line of encrypted USB flash drives. So they started selling them from 2010. The various devices called the Data Tracker, the Data Traveler Locker, Vault Privacy 4000, and only this one was certified to level 2. And then in 2015, they even brought the USB 3 devices to the market, one certified to FIPS 197 and another one to level 3. So that was directly competing with Ironkey device. And then after acquisition of Ironkey, they renamed this device to Ironkey D250, and that already had the level 3 certification and was already approved by NATO. That means they can sell it to military people. And from that time, they started selling Ironkey devices under Kingston name. And in 2018, the latest model of Ironkey device, D300S, was brought to the market with improved security features and certified. So at the moment, there are only 2 devices being sold on the market, S1000 and D300S. There are other manufacturers of encrypted USB flash drives. DataLocker have their devices, and some even certified to FIPS level 3. Integral have certified devices. MXI Security was selling devices until they were acquired by eMMC. Safe Access, iStorage have devices with numerical keypad and battery, and also certified to FIPS. And there are other manufacturers. So, if we try to compare this certification levels of those devices, there are two approaches for certified hardware. The one is the FIPS certification, and that has two widely used standards. FIPS 197 is only about the encryption used, and 140-2 is looking at the physical protection level on top of the encryption. And there are common criteria, assurance levels, but those are mainly applied to the secure hardware. For example, protection chips, the semiconductor chips that store secret or smart cards, and they have different levels. So the higher the level, the better the protection. So if we compare those devices, so from the beginning they both had a high level of certification, but then the FIPS certification went up for most of the devices, but for some devices there were no secure chips used, so the protection level in terms of secure hardware dropped down. And if you look at the two latest devices that are sold on the market, so the one does have the secure chip and certification, but another one does not have any secure chip, so it might be easier to break it. So as I mentioned, Ironkey devices are not easy to start tearing down, because first you have to bypass the robust metal case, and usually for that you would have to cut it with mechanical tools, and that of course will leave tamper evidence. But then you end up facing the whole PCB ported into epoxy compound. So you have to somehow remove it. You can try mechanical methods if applying forces, but very likely you will end up damaging the PCB, and this is because the epoxy will stick to the components and integrated circuits better than to the PCB. So even the components themselves will be teared apart. So for example, the BGA package will be broken at the shear line between the package and the substrate PCB. So what works better is thermal methods, because epoxy loses strength at above 150 degrees. Some epoxy compounds become soft like rubber, and some becomes brittle and could be broken with a knife, needle, or tweezers. But of course there's a danger of breaking off the PCB components on the solder them, so you have to carefully remove it. And for that, for example, you can use a soldering iron with a tip to carefully poke the epoxy for quite some time. So that's a long and tedious process, but in the end you will get the full access to the PCB components, and if you do it carefully, the device will still be fully operational. But of course that would take a long time, and some people are quite lazy, so they would prefer much more efficient ways that we can, for example, throw the device into something and then come later and it will be fully cleared up. And there do exist some methods for do it. You can use chemical methods. So because the epoxy is not good for harsh environment, it's corroded by acids, alkalines, organic solvents, and even hot water. And if you combine methods, that could bring better results. So what you do is you throw the device into certain chemicals, and after 24 hours, the half of the epoxy will be removed, and after 48 hours, you will end up with lots of mess and a completely cleared device that is fully functional. But you have to be careful, because the IC packages and also the PCB also contain epoxy as a part of the fabrication, so they could be affected as well. So there do exist other methods of removing the epoxy, like laser ablation, because the laser cutter is used to mark the components. Plasma methods could be used and widely used in failure analysis to remove epoxy material, and you can combine methods for better results. So the first Ironkey was relatively easy to open, because for some reason they had a metal case consisting of two parts, so you can see the lid on top. It's easy to use a knife to lift it up, and then you can use pliers to move the internal part outside, and then using thermal methods you remove the epoxy and get access to the components. So on the PCB there is a custom marked device called Ironkey, the standard NAND flash, and an Atmel secure authentication device. So this Ironkey device turned out, when you look at the die, that had nothing to do with Ironkey. It was manufactured by on spec incorporation, and that device did not have any non-volatile storage, so it only had mask ROM and SRAM. And the Atmel is the standard authentication device, that is Atmel Secure as ASSP, and that device is certified to AL5+. So it was quite a good solution from the Ironkey to make the key secure. So then the next version of the device had its metal case fixed, so you had to use cutting tools to open it up, and then I used chemicals to remove the epoxy. It uses the same secure chip for encryption, standard NAND flash, and slightly different authentication device from Atmel. And the reason for that is because this device is much cheaper than the previous one, so they probably tried to optimize the cost. If you look at this device, it had some marking on the surface, and that I will come back late in the talk what it actually means. But the device was also certified to the low level of protection. So not only they reduced the cost, but also they reduced the security level of the Ironkey. The next Ironkey device again had the same metal case, and the epoxy was removed with the thermal methods. In this device they changed the main encryption chip, but used the same Atmel security chip. So that encryption chip was now manufactured by Atmel, but looks like a custom device with only mask ROM and SRAM. So that's why they used a secure chip to store the key and passwords. And the next chip was the Imation Ironkey F150. And surprisingly, it had no metal case and no epoxy coating. So, and also the secure chip they used looked like a different bug on it. So it was a Bluefly processor, and there is some documentation on this chip, and the processor itself is FIPS certified. But it had no non-volatile storage, so there could be only two places where the encryption key and password attempts could be stored. So it could be either this serial flash chip, SSD, or it could be micro SD cards, which were relatively easy to remove from the device because they were in the sockets. The next Ironkey device had a proper metal case and epoxy compound, and this time it was based on encryption chip from Fison, very large manufacturer of such chips. So the many encrypted USB flash drives use products from Fison, standard NAND flash, and also the security chip that was marked as Ironkey. But again, it turned out that it's not the Ironkey device, it's just a marking on the chip surface, and the marking looks relatively familiar with what the Atmel device's marking look like, and later we'll identify what this device is. The next was the budgetary version of the Ironkey device, the plastic package, but because it was coated with epoxy, I had to cut it with mechanical tools, and then the epoxy was removed with chemical methods, and inside there's another Fison chip with similar characteristics and the standard NAND flash. And because Fison chip does not have any non-volatile storage, obviously this is the likely candidate for the NAND mirroring attacks that will be tested later. And the latest Imation device was S1000, the proper metal case and quite strong epoxy, so that I had a hard time removing that epoxy, and as you can see, some components were damaged, and but the NAND storage chip was removed without damaging it. And this was USB 3 device, and they had a quite interesting approach for building this device. So in order to improve the speed of the communication through the USB bus, they did not use any standard of NAND flash chips, but instead used a micro SSD drive from FISON. And that drive had the SATA 3 interface, the fastest from all the compact storage, the 6 gigabit per second interface. But in order to communicate with this chip, they had to use the SATA 3 bridge, and not the normal bridge, but the bridge that is capable of doing AES-256 encryption on the fly. And the only chip that can do this was from Renesas. And there's not much documentation on this chip from Renesas, but it does not have any non-volatile storage on it. That's why they use the same Ironkey secure chip inside that, in fact, is Atmel chip. And the latest Ironkey devices are D300 series, again with the similar metal package, and inside they have a FISON -15 chip, and because those were USB 3 devices, they started using eMMC memory for storage. And this device was had exactly the same PCB and exactly the same components as the latest Kingston DT4000G2 device. And that device was much easier to open because it had plastic package, and the epoxy is easier to remove with thermal methods. And inside there's the same FISON encryption chip and the Kingston eMMC flash. So instead of testing these devices, I tested this Kingston device. And also, if you look at the FIPS certification documents for those devices, and compare the certification for Kingston DT4000 and for Ironkey D300, then you won't see much difference apart from the text they changed in the document. So they just copy-pasted it, and they didn't even bother to change the picture of the device in the certification, despite the fact that certification of D300 was 4 years later. So those devices have exactly the same PCB revision, exactly the same components, even the firmware version is the same. So other Kingston devices with USB 3 interfaces are Data Traveler VP30 and Locker Plus G3, and inside they have very similar hardware, slightly different FISON microcontroller -13 instead of -15, and the same eMMC Kingston memory. And if you compare those two microcontrollers to see if there's much difference between them, you will find out that these are absolutely the same devices, the same hardware, the same marking on the silicon die, and they do not have any non-volatile storage, just mask ROM and SRAM. And that means that whatever security is used in those devices must be associated with eMMC memory. Other Kingston devices are Data Traveler 4000 and Data Traveler VP. They also use FISON controllers that are USB 2, all the devices. So instead of eMMC memory, they use standard NAND memory. And the interesting device is Data Traveler 2000 because it has a numeric keypad where you enter the password and then you plug the device and it appears like a normal USB drive. So inside they have a battery because you enter the password before plugging the device. And inside they have the same FISON -13 microcontroller, eMMC memory, but in order to manage the passwords and control the keyboard, they have an STM32 microcontroller. But in those devices, if you unplug the battery and connect it again, it doesn't affect the user password. So it is not stored in SRAM memory, so it's still stored in eMMC chip or in PIC microcontroller or STM microcontroller. So the similar device is from iStorage, called Datashur Pro. Very similar structure, slightly different microcontroller use, but pretty much the same components. And probably the most secure device in this range is the Datashur Pro2, because not only it has two PCBs inside the slightly different encryption controller, but also they have a secure chip that helps in improving the security. And that secure chip again looks with the very familiar marking from Atmel for Atmel devices. So it's not an iStorage device, it's just a remarked Atmel device, and that will be identified later in the talk. And the older iStorage devices, Datashur, again with the battery and different USB 2 microcontroller, standard NAND flash, and the PIC microcontroller for controlling the keyboard and storing the password attempts. From other manufacturers, the devices use very similar hardware, either FISON-15 or -13 microcontroller for USB 3 devices with eMMC memory storage. But some devices surprisingly have space for secure chips, so you can see this unused space where the QFN16 chip could be placed. So they probably thought about improving the hardware security of those devices, but I never came across the actual use of this. And DataLocker have their own range, and some devices are ported with, in this case, a fake epoxy, because it looks like ported into epoxy, but in fact it's just a black paint, which is easy to remove with paint remover. And again, they either use the standard FISON microcontroller with slightly older eMMC memory, still have a place for secure chip, and another device use Blockmaster chip, and that Blockmaster chip again doesn't have any non-volatile storage. It's just a mask ROM, small area, and the large area is with SRAM. And the last device I looked at was Safe Access, and again that had the already familiar FISON micro USB chip and eMMC flash and the space for secure chip. And so I tried to mount the NAND mirroring attacks to reinstate the number of password attempts on those chips. So I started with the simplest device, the Ironkey F150, because it was easy to access the memory. It was in the micro SD card connectors, and also this device had two storages. It has serial flash that I tested by soldering the adapter and then reading the flash in the standard universal programmer. But it turned out that this serial flash is not used for storing anything associated with password attempts. So I ended up building an adapter and plugging the micro SD card into the EasyJTAG Plus tool, which is very useful for reading out the raw images of the memory chips, because all those chips that are used in Ironkey devices, they do not have proper partitioning, so they just use those devices as a raw memory storage. So it's if you plug this chip into a normal computer, it will tell you that the device is not formatted, and you won't be able to read out and copy the data. But by storing the image and then restoring it after exhausting the password retry attempts, I was able to reinstate it back to the 10 attempts and try as many times as I like. So that means the Ironkey F150 was the first device vulnerable to NAND mirroring attacks. The next device I looked at was Ironkey D80, and it was much easier to work with because it has a standard flash memory storage, and that could be read either in this device, or it could be read in a universal programmer. And again, by restoring the image of the memory chip after exhausting password attempts, it was possible to bring it back to 10 attempts and so on. So Ironkey D80 is another device vulnerable to non-mirroring attacks. So now a few words about eMMC memory. So actually, eMMC memory is a device that consists of two parts. So they have a specialized controller and the standard NAND chip inside the BGA package. So the controller communication is standardized by EDEC, so we can read out the specification and talk to the controller. And the purpose of it is to perform error correction and wear leveling, so the device looks like a normal hard drive storage to the operating system. And also it manages low-level partitioning into multiple storage devices. So, for example, you can split it into the CD-ROM and the standard storage to from the point of view of the operating system. So that's why when you plug your secure USB device like Ironkey, it pretends to be the CD-ROM for storing the critical applications and as a normal hard drive for user files. But eMMC also has some security features, in particular password protection and replay protected memory block partition. And that partition has a one-time programmable symmetric authentication key, and which is also randomized with change response protocol. Also, any write access to that partition increments the dedicated write counter to prevent unauthorized overwriting. But inside the device, this controller has no non-volatile storage, so it relies storing any data inside this standard NAND flash chip. So if someone manages to get access to this standard NAND flash chip, he can reinstate all the settings and for example, password attempts or encryption key. So that's why I looked at the device, how easy would it be to access that NAND flash storage chip. So if you look at the device from the back side, so it has the balls for the standard eMMC connections, but also it has some extra test pads on the device, and I was curious where these test pads go to. So for that, I polished the chip from the solder side to down to the silicon dies to see where they are connected. And if you follow those traces, you will realize that all the connections between the controller chip and the memory chip are actually brought to the surface to those parts. So it's much easier to get access to the NAND flash than you thought, so you don't have to do any wire bonding or microprobing to access the chip. And also the controller has the reset pin, so you can easily disable the controller and then directly communicate with the flash memory chip and create the image of it. But in fact, for Ironkey devices, it was not necessary, because when I desoldered the chip and plugged it into this EasyJTAG Plus programmer, it gives you the printout of the configuration of the chip, and it immediately tells you that the password was not used, that the RPMB partition was not activated. So obviously they used this eMMC chip just as a memory storage. And I had a bit of a time to learn how to rebolt the chip and solder it back, because every time I had to read out the contents of the memory and write it back, I had to desolder the chip and then put the balls back on the chip and solder it back to the device to plug into a computer and to check the number of password attempts. But in the end, I succeeded, so I managed to restore the image of the eMMC chip back and reinstate the number of attempts. So that means that the latest Ironkey device, D300, is vulnerable to NAND mirroring attacks. So now a few words about Atmel secure chips. So the marking on this 1898 authentication chip matches the same on another Atmel secure device, 1890 SC 144-144, and also if you look on those devices, they are exactly the same. And 1898SC016 chip matches the same marking of another Atmel standard, not standard, the secure microcontroller device. So they actually, those 98SC authentication devices is just the firmware revision of standard Atmel devices. And then the secure chip that was marked as Ironkey in D250 and S1000 turned out to be another Atmel secure microcontroller. So this one, 28872, and secure chip in iStorage device in Datashur Pro turned out to be 1890 SO128. And also I found that all 1890SC secure chips in Ironkey in iStorage devices, they had a quite noticeable feature on the die. So they have 27 wires that go from the chip area outside of the die, and those are likely to be used for factory debugging and could represent a backdoor access to the chip. So you can, for example, either directly access all the internal resources of the chip, or you can force the chip into the factory test mode and exploit some pre-programmed test features that are present in mask-ROM. So mask-ROM in many 1890SC devices visible under optical microscope, so you can see this pattern on the chip. And also EEPROM can be extracted using electron microscopy method, so you can see that there's a difference between the bright and dark spotted that represents zeros and ones. But any probing access to the Atmel chips will require a lot of challenges, because they have a sensor mesh that covers the surface of the chip, and very likely they have multiple connections for those wires. So you will have to trace all the wires that cover the area of interest and then either disable them or reroute them using the FIPS. I also looked at some cryptocurrency wallet devices to see how the security level matches with the Ironkey and other encrypted USB drives. So, for example, Legend Nano S device, on the PCB they have a secure chip, and that is ST Microelectronics ST31 series, and that was produced in 2014. So it's about 8 years later than the Ironkey secure chips. And also the larger device, Nano X, uses ST33 microcontroller produced in 2015. So those chips have much more advanced fabrication process that they are much harder to break into. So obviously the security level of devices used in crypto wallets are probably an order of magnitude better than those used in Ironkey devices, despite the fact that Ironkey devices are aimed at military and government applications. So for future works, first you can find all the details about this presentation in my paper that was in archive.org, all the images and comparison table of encrypted USB flash drives. Obviously, more research needs to be done for offline password brute forcing, because so far I had to manually solder back the chip and try the passwords. But if that could be automated, if offline brute forcing, that would be much more efficient. It's not possible to extract the encryption key without knowing and trying the user key, because it's always encrypted with the user password. And if you, for example, emulate Nano eMMC interface, you can speed up the process of the hardware brute forcing. And also, if the secure element is used for password and AES key protection, then you can try to attack from that side by extracting the mask-ROM, descrambling it, extracting the EEPROM, and again descrambling it and decompiling the code, and also analyzing the backdoor interface in 1890SC devices and perform various attacks on those devices. So to conclude, I'll tear down 9 generations of Ironkey devices. Most devices have robust metal cases filled with epoxy compounds. They have secure chips used in all devices. However, latest models use eMMC flash storage, and 3 devices were found to be vulnerable to non-mirroring attacks. And as to the other encrypted USB flash drives, out of 15 devices I analyzed, 7 had the PCB epoxy filling, and only 1 device had a secure chip inside for ES key storage and password protection. And some devices have battery, but they do not benefit from extra security, for example, battery-backed SRAM. And what's more important is that the FIPS certification level does not guarantee the hardware security, so the device could be certified with a high FIPS level, but not having any secure element inside. And surprisingly, none of the devices used inherited security features of eMMC flash, because they do have this authenticated partition that can store some secret data. And also I found that IT98SC family is actually firmware programmed IT90SC chips, and those chips are likely to have some backdoor because they have a factory debug interface connected to the die. And as I mentioned, crypto wallets are likely to have better hardware security protection than Ironkey. So thank you for your attention. I hope you found it exciting.
Excellent. Any questions? Yeah, we have.
Thank you for the very informative talk. I was wondering if the USB microcontrollers that are involved on these devices, can they be reprogrammed for an evil-made attack so that they store the, let's say, user PIN or passphrase?
Those devices that rely on FISON controllers, they actually FISON have dedicated but proprietary tool, I think it's called MPAL, that you can find on some hacking websites that are dealing with USB drives recovery. So that tool allows you to configure the low-level partitioning, to configure the encryption they use, to configure other areas. So if you manage to get hold of that software, yes, you can reprogram FISON devices, because they have some part of the firmware on the mask ROM, but they can be reprogrammed to upload the firmware from external storage, in this case from NAND memory or from eMMC memory. So you can upgrade the firmware, and then you can force these devices to change their functionality.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions. First, I thought FIPS Level 3 required some sort of active countermeasures to detect intrusion and attempt to zeroize keys. Did you find any sort of measures like that?
Well, they do not have any measures at the physical level, so if you manage to go through the epoxy, it won't be detected. So the best protection they have is to rely on the secure elements of the Atmel secure microcontrollers, because those devices will store the encrypted key, and those devices will check that key against the user password, and then it also will implement the limiting number of password attempts. So that's the best protection they have.
And then my second question is, did you look at the NAND contents, and did any of the vendors do like Samsung did, where they were only password protecting but not actually encrypting the contents?
Yeah, for all the devices, the contents was encrypted. Even the contents they store for the CD-ROM image that they later represent as the fully accessible area. But also, if you compare the images after each password incorrect retry attempt, then they store some data, but those data look as a random and encrypted. So they don't store any information in plain text. So it's very difficult to figure out what they actually store. But for the purpose of reinstating the number of password attempts, you don't care, you just restore all the changed locations.
Any other questions?
Thank you. On the devices using secure chips, is the communication between the microcontroller and the secure element encrypted or not?
I didn't check the communication, but if you look at those FIPS certification documents that they have for those devices, they claim that the communication through the USB bus is encrypted, and also all the communication related with the key transfer is also encrypted. So that's the major requirements from the FIPS certification, that the encryption key never exposed in plain text. So it must always be encrypted between the secure microcontroller and the main ES encryption hardware device. Otherwise, they won't get certification.
I have a question. I know there's a few people here interested in masked ROM extraction. Are you going to publish good enough images that we could look at extracting and decompiling or disassembling the code?
I don't have the image of the whole mask ROM, but that can be produced. The only concern is that the storage is scrambled, because if you look at this image, you can see those. So those patterns, they come from the function that they apply to the data. It's a XOR function derived from the address. So that's why they end up, for the empty areas, they end up with the patterns, because the XOR value depends on the address, and that as an array, you see it under the microscope, will represent the different address lines, and that will be decoded with different values, and you end up with funny patterns on the surface. But you will have to somehow predict those values and descramble it, unless you can reverse engineer the logic and find out how the descrambling function works. But it's not straightforward to go from the mask ROM image to the code to disassemble.
Okay, interesting. We should talk offline, because there are tools for doing the extraction, and it will be easy to add the stages afterwards to try different things to descramble. So if we can get the binary out, then we can start playing with the data. So anyway, we talk offline about it. Yeah. So, any other questions? Excellent. Well, thank you very much.